Mexico is on high alert, but the president, Claudia Sheinbaum, says the country is at peace. Schools are closed in several states. Travel delays have left people stranded. And it's because a military operation that killed the leader of the Jalisco New Generation cartel. It's one of the country's most powerful criminal organizations.
They buried him like a king. A gold-plated casket, $1 million in flowers, military helicopters circling overhead, while the Mexican government watched in silence. The most feared cartel boss in history was gone, and what happened next shocked the entire world. Hundreds of armed men, rival cartels plotting attacks, a government forced to protect the very criminals they had been hunting for decades. This is the funeral that broke every rule, crossed every line, and exposed a truth about Mexico that nobody wanted to admit. And it all happened in a single day.
We are proud of the armed forces' efforts. The most important thing at this time is peace and security throughout the nation. As of today, we have more peace and tranquility. Security Cabinet has been convened, and there is a lot of coordination. So rest assured, we are safeguarding peace and security and normalcy throughout the country.
Some funerals are quiet affairs. A small gathering, a few flowers, maybe a modest reception afterward. And then there are funerals that require military helicopters, dozens of armed vehicles, and a government security operation large enough to rival a counterterrorism mission. The burial of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, better known as El Mencho, was very much the latter. What took place in Guadalajara, Mexico in early March 2026 was not simply the burial of a man. It was a carefully staged display of wealth, loyalty, and power that reportedly cost close to $1 million and forced the Mexican government into one of the most uncomfortable positions it had faced in years. To understand why this funeral happened the way it did, you first need to understand who El Mencho actually was. His story is not a straightforward one, and it does not fit the usual template people have in mind when they think of cartel leaders. He was not born into organized crime. He was not handed a criminal empire. He built one, almost entirely from scratch, and by the time of his death, he was considered by many law enforcement agencies to be the most powerful and dangerous criminal figure in Mexico, if not the entire Western Hemisphere. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was born in 1966 in Michoacan, Mexico. His early life was, by most accounts, unremarkable. He worked as a small-time avocado farmer, which is about as far removed from running a billion-dollar criminal operation as you can get. His entry into the world of drugs began with marijuana cultivation, a common starting point for many people in rural Mexican communities where the official economy offered very little in the way of opportunity or income. What separated El Mencho from others who followed a similar path was the combination of ambition, discipline, and a willingness to use extreme violence when he felt it was necessary. Before he moved fully into drug trafficking, El Mencho was heavily involved in cockfighting. This was not a minor hobby. It was a serious and lucrative business for him, and it was where a significant portion of his early money came from. His involvement in cockfighting also gave him his most well-known nickname, El Señor de los Gallos, which translates as the Lord of the Roosters. The rooster became his personal symbol, something that would follow him throughout his entire criminal career, and even into death. It is reported that when the CJNG wanted to leave a message for rivals or enemies, they would sometimes leave rooster feathers at the scene. The symbol carried genuine weight in the criminal world. That is why, when his funeral was arranged, the rooster was placed front and center. The organization El Mencho led is known as the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, or CJNG. He did not simply join this organization and work his way up. He was instrumental in building it into what it eventually became, which was, according to multiple intelligence assessments, the most powerful criminal organization in Mexico. That is a significant claim given how many powerful organizations operate in that country, but by most expert accounts, the CJNG had by the mid-2020s surpassed its rivals in terms of reach, revenue, and military capability. What made the CJNG different under El Mencho's leadership was its structure. Other cartels had always been primarily focused on moving drugs. The CJNG did that too, of course. Its trafficking routes ran from South America through Mexico and into the United States, moving cocaine, fentanyl, methamphetamine, and heroin worth billions of dollars every year. But El Mencho was not content to run a drug distribution network. He built what analysts and law enforcement officials consistently described as a paramilitary organization. The CJNG acquired armored vehicles. It had access to helicopters. Its members carried military-grade weapons that in some cases rivaled the equipment used by national armies. Mexican government forces engaged in direct armed confrontations with CJNG units on multiple occasions, and the cartel gave as good as it got. Beyond the violence, El Mencho ran his organization with a degree of corporate logic that surprised many observers. The CJNG collected taxes from businesses operating in territories it controlled. It provided a form of governance, however brutal and coercive, in areas where the Mexican state had limited presence. Estimates of the organization's annual revenue at its peak reach as high as $50 billion, though figures at that scale are difficult to verify with precision. What is not in dispute is that the CJNG became a major economic and political force across large parts of Mexico, one that the government could not simply ignore or remove. El Mencho himself was notably different from the popular image of a cartel boss. He did not court publicity. He was rarely photographed, and he almost never made public statements of any kind. While some criminal leaders in Mexico and elsewhere have embraced a degree of celebrity, building social media profiles and giving interviews, El Mencho operated in the opposite direction. He stayed in the shadows, moved constantly, and let the actions of his organizations speak for him. This approach made him extraordinarily difficult for law enforcement to track and ultimately contributed to the fact that he evaded capture for well over a decade, despite being one of the most wanted men on the planet. The United States Drug Enforcement Administration placed a $10 million bounty on his head, making him one of a very small number of individuals to carry a reward of that size. That figure alone tells you something about how seriously American law enforcement viewed him as a threat. The DEA does not hand out $10 million bounties lightly. It is a designation reserved for individuals considered to pose a genuine and significant danger to public safety at an international level. El Mencho held that designation for years. His cartel also became known for a level of violence that even by Mexican cartel standards was considered extreme. The CJNG did not shy away from confrontations with the Mexican military. It launched attacks on government convoys. It carried out mass killings of rival cartel members, and on occasion, civilians. It was an organization that operated on the principle that overwhelming force and a willingness to escalate beyond what any rival would dare were the most effective tools available. That philosophy came directly from the top. By the time El Mencho's health began to fail, he had spent more than a decade as the central figure in Mexico's most powerful criminal organization. With a bounty on his head, military operations designed specifically to find and capture him, and the full attention of both Mexican and American intelligence services. None of it had managed to bring him down. In the end, it was his kidneys, not law enforcement, that ended his story. On March 2nd, 2026, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes died. The man who had spent more than a decade as the most wanted criminal in Mexico, who had survived military operations, government task forces, and the combined intelligence efforts of multiple countries, did not go out in a blaze of gunfire or get taken down in a dramatic raid. He died in a bed, in a private medical facility in Mexico City, from complications related to chronic kidney disease. It was, in Mioced, the most literal sense, an ordinary death for an extraordinarily dangerous man. What made the circumstances even more remarkable was the fact that El Mencho had been receiving treatment at this facility under a false identity. According to sources close to the investigation, he had been registered as a patient under the name Carlos Ramirez. The clinic itself was not some back alley operation. It was a high-end private medical facility, the kind of place where wealthy Mexicans went for serious treatment, and it operated under strict confidentiality. El Mencho had apparently been receiving dialysis there for some time, moving between different medical facilities as his condition worsened, using multiple fake identities to avoid detection. The kidney disease had significantly limited his ability to move around, which, according to federal authorities, helped explain why all the advanced tracking technology and intelligence resources focused on finding him had come up empty for so long. Man on dialysis cannot travel freely. He cannot disappear into a remote mountain location or cross borders at will. He needs regular, consistent medical attention, and that requirement ultimately created a paper trail, even if it took time for anyone to follow it far enough to matter. Medical staff at the facility later told investigators that Carlos Ramirez had been a quiet and cooperative patient. He always paid in cash, never caused problems, and gave no outward indication that he was anything other than a wealthy private patient seeking treatment for a serious illness. Nothing about his behavior raised flags. Nothing suggested to the people caring for him that they were sitting across from the leader of Mexico's most violent and powerful criminal organization. To them, he was simply a sick man trying to get better. The reality of who he was only became apparent after his death, and by that point there was very little anyone could do except deal with the consequences. Approximately 48 hours after his death, Mexican authorities had no idea that the most wanted man in the country was lying in a morgue in their own capital city. The medical staff had been treating Carlos Ramirez, not El Mencho, and there was no immediate reason for anyone to look further than that. It was only when fingerprints were processed through the system that the identification was made and the full reality of the situation became clear to investigators. The man they had been hunting for over a decade with a $10 million American bounty on his head had been dying in Mexico City the entire time, receiving routine medical care under a name that meant nothing to anyone outside of a patient file. The reaction among the medical staff, once the identity of their patient was revealed, was one of considerable fear. Several members of the facility's team required police protection in the days that followed, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they were now potential targets. Any organization as powerful and as ruthless as the CJNG could not be expected to simply accept that strangers had been caring for their leader without some degree of scrutiny, and rival criminal organizations might equally see those individuals as useful sources of information. Being caught in the middle of that situation through no fault of their own was genuinely dangerous, and the authorities took the threat to their safety seriously. By the time Mexican authorities had confirmed the identity of the body, it became clear that the CJNG was already several steps ahead. Intelligence sources later revealed that the cartel had known their leader was dying for some time and had been preparing for this moment months in advance. They had logistics plans in place. They had security protocols ready to activate. They had already begun identifying the arrangements that would need to be made once the time came. Within hours of El Mencho's death being confirmed, CJNG operatives were reported to be mobilizing across multiple Mexican states. Intercepted phone communications referred to bringing the boss home and preparing for what was described internally as the biggest event in cartel history. This was not a group caught off guard by grief. This was a large and well-funded organization executing a plan it had already carefully drawn up, and the speed at which it moved in those first hours demonstrated just how prepared it had been. The Mexican government found itself in an extremely difficult position almost immediately. On paper, they finally had physical custody of one of the most wanted men in their country's history. That was, by any measure, a significant moment. But the practical reality of what to do next was far more complicated than it might appear from the outside. Intelligence assessments indicated that multiple factions within the CJNG were already maneuvering to position themselves for control of the organization following El Mencho's death. The cartel was not a simple hierarchy that would transfer power cleanly from one person to the next. It was a collection of powerful individuals and regional groups, each with their own interests, and the death of the man at the top created a vacuum that different parties would compete to fill. How the government handled his body and the question of his funeral could directly influence whether that transition became a violent internal war or a more controlled, if still deeply criminal, handover of power. High-level meetings were held between military commanders, intelligence officials, and government ministers. The options were debated carefully and seriously. Keeping the body, using it as leverage, refusing to release it to the family, these were all possibilities that were put on the table and examined. But the conclusion reached, according to sources within the Mexican Attorney General's office, was that releasing the body was the least dangerous path available, lying. The family access risked triggering immediate violence from multiple directions at once, as different groups within the CJNG competed to demonstrate who had the authority and the strength to respond to the perceived disrespect. The potential for that scenario to spiral quickly into widespread bloodshed across several states was considered very real. There was also direct pressure coming from El Mencho's wife, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, who was already a significant and influential figure within the cartel's financial operations, and not someone the government could easily dismiss or ignore. Intelligence intercepts reportedly revealed that she had made direct and specific threats against government officials, warning of serious retaliation if her husband's body was not released for a proper burial. Whether those threats were the single deciding factor or simply one element among many in a complex calculation, the government ultimately chose to release the body. It did so, however, with clear conditions attached. The family was required to handle all transportation and burial arrangements themselves. The funeral could only be held in approved locations. Mexican security forces would maintain a visible and active presence throughout all proceedings, and nothing about the event would happen outside of their awareness. The government's position was essentially that the family could have the body, but the state would be watching every single thing they did with it, and every person who showed up to pay their respects. It was, in effect, a negotiated arrangement between a government and a criminal organization, and the fact that such a negotiation was even necessary said a great deal about the actual balance of power in parts of Mexico at that particular moment in time. The transfer of El Mencho's body from Mexico City to Guadalajara was itself a significant security undertaking. Mexican authorities insisted on escorting the hearse with military vehicles and established checkpoints along the entire route to monitor and control who and what was moving through the corridor. The concern was not simply about maintaining public order along a motorway. Intelligence reports indicated that rival cartels were watching the situation closely, with the Sinaloa cartel specifically mentioned in some accounts as an organization that was carefully assessing its options. El Mencho's death created a window of potential vulnerability for the CJNG, and some rival organizations were apparently weighing whether to take advantage of it. A funeral convoy moving across hundreds of kilometers of Mexican roads was a potential target, and the government was not willing to allow an attack to occur while the body was under their escort. During the transport, unusual activity was detected from multiple criminal organizations operating in the regions along the route. Some rivals saw the CJNG's necessary focus on funeral arrangements as an opportunity to move against their operations, or encroach on their territories while attention was elsewhere. Others recognized that the funeral itself would draw significant CJNG leadership into a single location, which presented an entirely different kind of opportunity. The Mexican government was aware of both scenarios, and that awareness shaped every decision made about how the proceedings would be managed and secured from beginning to end. There was also a more calculated intelligence dimension to the government's decision to allow the funeral to go ahead at all. They understood that an event of this significance would pull CJNG leadership out of the shadows. People who had spent years avoiding any situation where they might be identified, photographed, or tracked would feel an obligation, personal or political, to attend. Surveillance operations were set up accordingly, and government sources later confirmed that dozens of high-ranking CJNG operatives were positively identified at the funeral, providing intelligence that would directly feed into future operations against the organization in the months that followed. Allowing the funeral to happen was not simply a concession to criminal power. It was, at least in part, a deliberate and calculated intelligence-gathering exercise dressed up as a reluctant accommodation. What the intercepted communications had already made abundantly clear was that this funeral was not going to be a small, quiet, or private affair under any circumstances. The CJNG had described it internally as the biggest funeral in Mexican history and had extended invitations to cartel members from multiple countries. The level of organization behind the planning, according to Mexican intelligence assessments, was genuinely comparable to what governments put into state funerals for heads of state. Supply chains, security protocols, guest logistics, and contingency plans had all been worked out in advance. This was not going to be a family gathering at a local church. It was going to be a very public, very expensive, and very deliberately staged demonstration of what the CJNG still was, and intended to remain even without the man who had spent decades building it into what it had become. When the body of Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes finally arrived in Guadalajara, the city was already on edge. Military vehicles were positioned throughout the surrounding streets. Helicopters moved overhead. Checkpoints had been established at key entry points to the neighborhood where the funeral home was located, and normal traffic had been diverted away from the entire area for the duration of the proceedings. For the residents living nearby, the message was clear even before a single flower arrangement had been carried through the door. What was about to take place was not an ordinary funeral. It was something that required the kind of security presence more commonly associated with visits from foreign heads of state or major international summits, and the people organizing it had planned it that way deliberately. The CJNG chose Funeraria Funerales La Paz, located in the Colonia San Andres area of Guadalajara, as the venue for the wake and viewing. The funeral home itself was not the most expensive or prestigious facility in the city, but that was not the point. It was situated in an area where the cartel had significant influence and control, which mattered far more to the people organizing the event than the prestige of the address. What the CJNG spent to transform that standard facility into something befitting their leader, however, was anything but ordinary. The money poured into that building over the course of the funeral proceedings represented a level of expenditure that most people would struggle to comprehend, even when presented with the individual line items broken down one by one. The flowers alone told the story more clearly than almost anything else. The centerpiece of the entire floral display was a giant rooster constructed entirely from roses, standing approximately 6 feet tall, with the letters C, J, N, G prominently featured at the top. This was not a simple wreath or a conventional funeral arrangement. It was, by any reasonable definition, a sculpture. Professional florists were reportedly brought in from other cities specifically to work on this single piece, each rose placed individually by hand to create a structure that was recognizable as El Mencho's personal symbol from across the room. According to reports from Mexican news outlets, including Azteca Noticias, the craftsmanship involved in creating a realistic rooster from thousands of individual flowers required specialized skills that were not readily available locally. The rooster was not simply decorative, it was a direct and intentional reference to El Mencho's nickname, El Señor de los Gallos, and to the symbol that had represented his authority throughout his criminal career. The cost of this arrangement alone was estimated at somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000, and that figure did not include the security that had to be provided for the florists working under such unusual and potentially dangerous circumstances. But the rooster was just the beginning. Surrounding it were between 20 and 30 large coronas, each one containing somewhere between 500 and 1,000 white roses. Reports from Ellen Marshall and Mexico News Daily confirmed the scale of these arrangements, which functioned more like art installations than anything you would typically see at a funeral service. When you work through the numbers, factoring in the cost of premium roses in Mexico at roughly $2 to $5 per stem, and the significant labor costs involved in assembling arrangements of that size and complexity, the total flower budget for the entire event comes out somewhere between $50,000 and $150,000. That is more money than many Mexican families earn over the course of several years spent entirely on flowers that would begin to wilt within days of being placed in that room. One particular arrangement, reported by Mexico News Daily, carried a message reading from a family that will always be grateful, positioned prominently near the casket. It was constructed entirely from red roses and designed in a way that, according to observers, made the lettering appear to be written in blood. Whether or not that was the consciously intended effect, it was entirely consistent with the visual language of an organization that had never shied away from making its point through imagery as much as through direct action. Every detail of the floral display, from the rooster to the individual coronas to the arrangements placed closest to the body, had been chosen and designed with a specific meaning in mind. Nothing about it was accidental. The casket drew considerable attention from anyone who reported on the event. Standard burial coffins in Mexico cost in the region of 1,500 pesos, which amounts to roughly $375. According to official statistics, El Mencho's casket was operating in an entirely different category. It was reportedly gold-plated, custom-designed, and featured engraved detailing, premium interior fabric, and specialized hardware that made it as much a statement piece as a functional burial container. Conservative estimates placed the cost at somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000 for a high-end gold-plated casket of this type. However, some sources suggested the figure could reach as high as $200,000 if the gold content was substantial rather than purely decorative plating. The wide range in those estimates reflects genuine uncertainty about the exact specifications, but given the wealth available to the organization and the symbolic importance they had clearly placed on every other aspect of the funeral, the higher end of that range is entirely plausible. Funeral industry sources who spoke anonymously to journalists noted that a casket of this specification would typically require months of advanced preparation, which aligned perfectly with the broader picture of a cartel that had been planning this funeral long before the death actually occurred. The burial plot represented a further significant expense. El Mencho was laid to rest in a cemetery in San Juan de Ocotan, in the Zapopan municipality. Premium burial plots in that area are typically valued at between $10,000 and $30,000, but the CJNG did not simply purchase a single plot for their leader. According to reports, they acquired an entire section of the cemetery, ensuring that the immediate area around his grave would remain under their control and could be secured and managed on their own terms going forward. This was not a sentimental gesture. It was a practical decision made by an organization that understood the value of controlling physical space, and that had every intention of maintaining a presence at that site for years to come. Transportation costs, though perhaps less dramatic than the flowers or the casket, were still a notable part of the overall budget. Moving the body from Mexico City to Guadalajara required a specially equipped hearse, refrigeration equipment to preserve the body over the course of the journey, and careful coordination with the military convoy that accompanied it the entire way. On top of that, the massive flower arrangements had to be transported separately in vehicles capable of carrying them without causing damage to structures that had taken skilled professionals considerable time to build. Total transportation costs were estimated at between $2,000 and $5,000, a relatively modest figure in the context of everything else, but still reflective of the logistical complexity involved in moving this particular funeral from one city to another. The reception and memorial services added another layer of significant expense. The CJNG organized food and drinks for hundreds of mourners, including cartel members who had traveled from across Mexico and, according to intelligence sources, potentially from other countries as well. This was not a simple gathering with basic refreshments. It was a multi-day event requiring professional catering services capable of feeding a large and varied crowd while maintaining the security and discretion that a gathering of this nature absolutely demanded. The estimated cost for food, drinks, venue arrangements, and catering coordination came in at between $10,000 and $20,000, covering what amounted to a sustained operation over several days rather than a single afternoon reception. Private security was one of the most substantial individual cost items in the entire operation. While the Mexican government provided military security around the outer perimeter of the event, the CJNG deployed their own security forces within and immediately around the funeral home to protect against potential attacks from rival organizations. This private operation involved armed personnel, armored vehicles, and dedicated communication equipment, and was estimated to have cost somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000. The government presence, meanwhile, was on an entirely different scale. According to El Imparcial, dozens of military vehicles and at least one helicopter were actively patrolling the area throughout the duration of the funeral. The deployment involved units from the Mexican Army, the National Guard, and state police, and the security perimeter extended for several blocks in every direction. The cost of that government operation was never officially disclosed, but estimates involving helicopter usage alone, which runs to thousands of dollars per hour, and the deployment of specialized counterterrorism level units, suggest the total resources committed ran into millions of pesos. The Mexican state was, in effect, funding a significant portion of the security operation for a criminal organization's internal event, a fact that did not go unnoticed by critics both inside and outside the country. When you add everything up, the conservative end of the estimate for the funeral costs comes out at somewhere around $478,000. The realistic high-end figure reaches between $500,000 and $1 million. For context, documents reported by El Grafico revealed that the CJNG had previously spent approximately 25,000 pesos, roughly $1,250, on the funeral of a low-ranking cartel member. El Mencho's send-off represented an increase of approximately 800 times that baseline amount. That comparison is striking not just as a demonstration of the gulf between the organization's leadership and its foot soldiers, but as a reflection of how much symbolic and political weight the cartel placed on this particular moment in its history. This was not simply a funeral. It was an investment in the organization's reputation and a statement about its continued relevance in the landscape of Mexican organized crime. The aftermath of the funeral provided some of the most telling evidence of what it had actually meant in practical terms. Within weeks, intelligence sources reported increased violence across several Mexican states as factions within the CJNG began competing for control of the organization's most profitable territories and trafficking routes. The elaborate funeral, rather than projecting the unity and continuity it had clearly been designed to suggest, may have inadvertently highlighted the enormous wealth now up for grabs and accelerated the internal conflicts that followed. Mexican authorities used the intelligence gathered during the event to launch several significant operations against the cartel in the months that followed, with a number of arrests directly linked to identifications made during the funeral proceedings. The decision to allow the event to proceed had, from the government's perspective, paid dividends in ways that the cartel had not anticipated. The broader legacy of what happened in Guadalajara that week extended well beyond the cartel world itself. Social media coverage of the event, despite efforts by authorities to limit the spread of images and information, sparked widespread public debate about inequality in Mexico. The observation made by many commentators that El Mencho had received a more elaborate and expensive funeral than many Mexican presidents landed with considerable force in a country where millions of families struggle to cover basic burial costs for their own loved ones. For communities that had suffered directly at the hands of the CJNG, the images of gold-plated caskets and thousands of roses were painful in a way that went beyond simple outrage. They represented a visible and undeniable illustration of the resources available to those operating outside the law compared to those trying to live within it. For international law enforcement agencies and organized crime researchers, the funeral served as a detailed and unusually well-documented case study in how modern criminal organizations operate at the highest level. The planning, the logistics, the financial resources deployed, and the ability to negotiate directly with the national government over the handling of a leader's remains all pointed to an organization functioning with the sophistication and structural complexity of a legitimate multinational corporation. That comparison is uncomfortable, but it is one that analysts and investigators have returned to repeatedly when discussing the CJNG and the broader evolution of large-scale organized crime in the 21st century. What El Mencho's funeral ultimately demonstrated, more clearly than perhaps any single event before it, was that the line between criminal power and institutional power in certain parts of Mexico had become genuinely difficult to locate. A government that provides military security for a cartel funeral, however pragmatic the reasoning behind that decision, is a government operating in a reality where the usual boundaries have shifted considerably. The flowers have long since wilted, the helicopters have moved on, and the streets around that Guadalajara funeral home have returned to whatever passes for normal. But the questions raised by what happened there have not gone away, and the precedent set by an organization willing to spend close to $1 million simply to bury its leader will not be forgotten quickly by anyone paying close attention to how power actually operates in that part of the world.